Hello, this is Mark Tooley, editor of Providence, a journal of Christianity and American foreign policy, with another episode of Marksism with fellow Marks and fellow editors Mark Livecki and Mark Melton. We'll be discussing, of course, Ukraine, specifically the nuclear weapons aspect of the Ukraine-Russia conflict and the proposals bandied about by some, not by us, for potential no-fly zones that would entail direct U.S. conflict with Russian forces. We'll also take a look at a piece on Christian nationalism and David French, somewhat provocatively. But first, Ukraine, nuclear weapons, and no-fly zones. We posted an article by our regular contributor and just war scholar, Daryl Charles, quoting extensively from Christian just war ethicist Paul Ramsey about the importance of ongoing force, importance of force in world affairs, and the importance of America's nuclear deterrent and wielding its threats competently and judiciously. So some important points. Daryl Charles in his article does not advocate a direct U.S. intervention into the Ukraine-Russia conflict. Other friends have hinted at it or even advocated for it, at least online in social media. I believe the Marks are unified in opposing any such direct U.S. intervention in Ukraine, even though there is a humanitarian appeal to it, but the consequences would be unpredictable and certainly, almost certainly, an expansion of the war that could potentially be cataclysmic. But first, let's go to our own in-house just war scholar, Mark Livecki. Your response to Daryl Charles, to the topic of nuclear weapons as they relate to this conflict, and why you're opposed to direct U.S. intervention in this war, Mark Livecki.
All right, just for clarification, will we back to the no-fly zone, or is this included in this question?
Everything you want to address is included in this question.
I just don't want to take any of the gunfire away from the next round of questions. Okay, Daryl's article, insightful as always. I think he goes through some sort of Christian realism 101. He talks about the essay of politics in Paul Ramsey's view, which is the use of power. He doesn't shy away from it. He makes a case for power projection. Through there, he goes into a conversation about Paul Ramsey's deterrence, and the question of deterrence, particularly nuclear deterrence, and Ukraine is an important one. The heart of deterrence, the heart of using nuclear weapons as deterrence, is to protect a nation's vital interests. And when we take that concept and we wrap it around to Ukraine, then we're confronted with the sort of big, ugly realities of Ukraine, where Putin seems legitimately to consider Ukraine a kind of vital interest for his project, whether his project's the recreation or reunification of Holy Mother Russia, or simply, slightly less transcendentally, the recreation of at least an aspect of the great Soviet Empire. Ukraine appears to be a kind of vital interest for Putin. And when he begins to rattle his nuclear saber over that issue, it takes it to a different dimension, and it reveals the frustrating but genuine truth that for the United States, Ukraine is important, but it is not vital. And so then when it comes to escalation, Putin has a lot of leverage on his side. And the question of whether or not we're going to escalate to the point of using or threatening to use nuclear weapons, we don't have any reliability there. I think Putin knows it's not a vital interest. And I think he knows that when it comes to gambling on these sorts of things, we're not going to be willing to throw those kinds of dice over this kind of issue. As to the question of, okay, that said, backtrack a little bit. Nevertheless, power projection and deterrence still play a role here. And so Biden recently canceled a planned test of American nuclear weapons. That seems to me a ridiculous mistake.
Now, why do you say that? Wasn't that just being cautious and prudent?
I think no. I think it's a blink. I think it's a planned test. We test our nuclear weapons. We demonstrate that there is still at some level, and then we still have to admit this. It seems, and might bring up the question of the escalation ladder at some point. At some point, one could project that America might begin to have to assess, depending on what Putin does, whether or not we would resort first simply to direct military force, and after that, at some point, can this escalate to a point where nuclear weapons become actually a viable option? That would only happen if a number of other things on Putin's part occur. If he attacks a NATO ally, if he invades a NATO ally, on and on and on, right? But that escalation at some point for us may include nuclear weapons. It doesn't seem prudent to signal to the degree that we seem to be that, no, this is never going to be an option here. The test is just a test. We have, the other thing I would say about this to soften it a bit is that I think right now most people are thinking that a nuclear exchange is going to mean bombs dropping on Los Angeles and London and New York and Washington, D.C. and all of that. It doesn't necessarily have to mean that. We have low yield, theater specific tactical nuclear weapons. Those might be the kinds of things that Putin, who also has them, he may use. If he uses a tactical nuclear weapon within Ukraine or on a NATO ally, the exchange that results or could result might simply be a tactical exchange. Now, that's a horrific thing. A tactical exchange is likely to lead or possibly lead to a strategic exchange, but it doesn't have to. And it doesn't seem prudent to signal up front that none of those things are going to happen. And I know simply canceling a test doesn't signal, oh, these things will never happen. But it seems to me it sends the wrong message, especially for a guy like Putin, who I don't think is looking for the reassurance that we're not going to escalate. I think he's using these things as blackmail. Don't dare escalate because I've got some things I want to get done. And if you mess with my plans, I'm going to get you. And I think by ratcheting back on basic things like tests, we signal to him that your threat is working. I don't think it's a de-escalation in his mind. I think it's an empowerment. It enables him to feel like what he's doing is going to be given some permission. So that's that.
Let me ask this, that those who would like to have a no-fly zone, the projection of U.S. power into the Ukraine on behalf of the Ukrainian people, some would say, well, if it only weren't for nuclear weapons, certainly we would do so. I would say, no, we would still oppose that avoidable escalation, in that you do not escalate small wars into larger wars between superpowers if it's at all avoidable, unless there is some vital national interest at stake. Don't you agree?
Yeah, that's a great way of framing the question. It puts me in a pickle because I'm not entirely sure I do agree. Because what I would say is something like this, and I'll defend this to a point, but this is a projection. This might be the Sicilian blood and not my rational hat. But I would say something like this: when I look at what's happening, because of what appears to be, and again, I would want access to better information than I'm getting on Twitter in order to be able to make a sound judgment on these things. But there's videos of the Russian army targeting civilian blocks from which they are not being fired upon or anything like that. The type of civilian-focused warfare that Putin appears completely willing to engage in, I think does warrant a response. And I might begin my response by saying something like this: the no-fly zone, if that were helpful, like if that would truly sort of even the odds and give Ukraine a fighting chance, protect civilians, protect civilian infrastructures, all the rest, then I might say something like, we ought to do that, using the ought, saying we have a moral, it would be morally appropriate to impose a no-fly zone. And this would be for both Ukraine and Russia. Because they have nuclear weapons, I would say, even though we ought to employ a no-fly zone, we mustn't do it, because that might actually mean that the heavens fall. If they don't have nuclear weapons, I might say, yep, impose that no-fly zone because of the kind of war that he's fighting. Now, one caveat would be if that takes our eyes off China, then we don't impose a no-fly zone. We have NATO impose it. We stay focused on China. There'd be other mitigating factors, but I would be much more open to a no-fly zone if Putin did not have nuclear weapons. I would be very open to being talked down from that, but that wouldn't be my starting position. I think the nukes make a huge difference, plus the presence of China makes a huge difference. Those are the two mitigating factors for me.
I see your point, but I would still say that a wise superpower operates through proxies whenever possible and avoids a direct confrontation with another superpower that could lead to a wider conflagration. But
For sure.
let's take a break from Ukraine for a moment. And Mark Melton, tell us about this piece by Mark David Hall, our contributor out at Seattle Pacific, who provocatively wrote a defense of David French, the Christian commentator, a frequent critic himself of Christian nationalism, and often the target of Christian conservatives for his ongoing critiques of what he believes is wrong with much of evangelicalism today. And yet Mark David Hall defends David French as not a Christian nationalist, because there are many critics of quote unquote Christian nationalism who think that any kind of advocacy for Christian conversation in the public square, any ardent defense of domestic religious freedom, any hearkening back to the spiritual roots of American democracy equates to Christian nationalism. David French was previously employed by Alliance Defending Freedom, which defends persons' religious freedom when threatened here in the US. Typically, those persons are Christians. ADF is labeled by some critics as Christian nationalist. So, Mark Melton, what is your analysis of this defense of David French as not a Christian nationalist?
And I'll have to speak to this as someone who hasn't read David French's article that he was responding to or the books. But to summarize what Mark David Hall was talking about is that his overall argument is that Christian nationalism is a thing, but it's not as big as what some people are describing. And that apparently, I think it was in the book by, I think, Perry and Whitehead, where they give a survey of, like, if you say yes and no to these things, then you are a Christian nationalist or you're an ambassador, or like they have different levels, apparently, is the gist of the article. And he was saying, kind of like he gave, if David French was to write this or answer these questions, he assesses that, they would say that he is an ambassador for Christian nationalism. And Mark David Hall's point on this is that that's a ridiculous statement. French is not this, but their surveys implies he would be. And so he says, like, the entire survey should probably be thrown out because it's not applicable. And so it seems to me, kind of reading this, that the survey almost implies if you don't accept a French laïcité vision of secularism, then you are a Christian nationalist, versus believing that Christianity can be, or like people can express their religion in the public square. And having lived in France, it's interesting where you're not really, there's a legal laïcité that you're not allowed to do things. Like, I wasn't allowed to wear a cross when I taught at the lycée, but if you were outside, you could legally do it in places, but it was kind of socially frowned upon. And so I would say there seems to be a big difference between wanting that laïcité. If you're against that laïcité in America, then that doesn't make you a Christian nationalist, and it makes you honestly probably more mainline what most Americans are, as far as a willingness to have some faith in the public square. So that's kind of a short gist of what that article is about.
Well, Mark Levesque, are you a Christian nationalist?
According to my old friend Sam Perry, I'm a die-hard red-blooded Christian nationalist through and through. I haven't read the book. I don't know what the other three questions are. I think there are 6 questions, right? Those 3 questions.
I think there's actually 24. There's a lot, but he highlighted it. I think he highlighted like 3 or 4 questions in the article.
There's a whole bunch. Okay, so I don't know the rest of the questions. Those 3 questions that he asks, I would answer. I mean, they're just ridiculous questions. No offense, Sam. We can have a beer about it sometime in the pub and talk about it. But the questions as they stand, one of the questions was something to the effect of, should the United States allow prayer in school? Well, but is it in the gym? Is it after hours? Does the teacher force it? Right. So you can only answer that question with, but if you're forced to answer, then sure. But I have in my head, it's not going to be forced. It's, other options. It could be anywhere in this. So it seems like a ridiculous survey. I would answer in a way that I'm sure I would be a Christian nationalist. My wife and I'm going to do a Joe Biden here. My wife and I support ATF. Right. So like we are, we're Christian nationalists. I didn't know that. So I'm grateful to Sam for telling me that. No, I mean, the strength of the article is it just proves what I think is unfortunately the weakness of Sam and Whitehead. I don't know Whitehead, of Sam's position. They cook it so that everybody conservative, it seems, is a Christian nationalist, and then they define Christian nationalist in such a way that like nobody I know would actually even admit to being one or countenance being one, because it includes necessarily nativism and patriarchalism and white supremacy and other ridiculous things. So there it is.
Well, it's bizarre. They demonize Christian nationalism, and yet they portray the way they broadly define it. About 80% of America is Christian nationalists, including
Right.
white mainline liberal Protestants who have American flags in their sanctuaries. So it's an absurd contradiction.
We should invite Sam Perry to do a response if he was misrepresented in his book. So Sam, it's in your court.
Perhaps next week he can join an episode of Marksism.
Mark, and Sam.
Until that time, fellow Marks, thank you for this latest episode. See you next week. Bye-bye.